Today's episode is the story of war, doubt, and unexpected faith. It's about a man known for his battlefield courage, his service to his country, and a novel that became one of the most beloved Christian books of all time. Welcome back to the Church History Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Lee. I know that today's Tuesday, and so I'm a day late with this week's episode. This weekend was Mother's Day, and yesterday my youngest daughter and I spent the day together thrifting, something we both love doing. And since she's home from college, I will take any opportunity I can to spend time with her. The summer's going to fly by. She'll be leaving again at the end of August to go back to university. I hope you all had a really good Mother's Day weekend. Growing up, we didn't watch TV in our home, but occasionally we would have a movie night. The movies we watched were picked carefully, and there were 3 movies that we would watch often, probably yearly. The Sound of Music, that was because my mother's family actually left Germany in the middle of the night and came to Canada with nothing, leaving behind all their wealth. So the story of Sound of Music was personal and one that my mother really loved and helped me to love that story as too. The second was Charlton Heston's The 10 Commandments. Obviously, one of the greatest movies of all time. And the third movie is Ben-Hur. Now, one of my core memories is sitting with my mom watching the scene where Judah witnesses the death of Jesus. And as the blood mixes with the rain and begins to flow like a river, my mother began singing, "There is a fountain filled with blood." And to this day, when I hear that hymn sung, it is the scene from this movie that floods my mind. I personally believe Ben-Hur is one of the greatest movies ever made. And when my children were little, a cartoon version of that movie was released. And of course, I bought that. But I never actually knew the story behind Ben-Hur. And as I was researching a few weeks ago for a different episode, the name Lew Wallace came up. And he was the author of Ben-Hur. So of course I went down the rabbit trail to understand who this man was. And when I learned his story, I knew this had to be an episode. This was a story I had to share with you, my fellow church history fanatics. So here is the story of Lew Wallace. Imagine the dusty streets of a small Indiana town in the early 1800s. A horse-drawn carriage rumbling past wooden storefronts, boys playing along the riverbanks, and men in stovepipe hats discussing politics of a growing nation over newspapers and tobacco. This is the world Lew Wallace was born into in the year 1827. A country still young and full of possibility. Indiana was a new state then, and the frontier spirit ran strong. Lew Wallace's father, David Wallace, was the governor of Indiana and a former U.S. congressman. The Wallace family was one of ambition and discipline. But Lewis, he had a restless spirit. By 16, he had left school and was working as a clerk. But books, especially those about adventure and war, captivated him. America was expanding, and the call to arms rang out loud in 1846 as the country went to war with Mexico. Young men across the Midwest, many barely out of boyhood, enlisted with dreams of glory in their hearts and muskets on their shoulders. And Lew Wallace was one of them. He actually raised a company of volunteers, the 1st Indiana Regiment, and they set off for the Mexican-American War. It was supposed to be a grand adventure, marching through the exotic lands, proving courage, and maybe returning a hero. But war, as it always does, had other plans. Much of Lewis's time was spent on garrison duty, surrounded by the heat and the sickness of army camps more than the clamor of battle. He saw death, not in glorious charges, but in slow suffering, in young men broken by disease and despair. This was a sobering education about war, and one that left a deep mark on his soul. When he returned to Indiana in 1847, he tried settling into civilian life, He studied law in Indianapolis, he opened up a small practice, and he even tried his hand at newspaper editing. And for a while, it seemed he might leave war behind. But the drums of war would beat again. By 1861, America stood on the brink of tearing itself apart. The Civil War erupted like thunder across the country. Families were split, towns emptied of young men, and every community held its breath, wondering if this great nation would survive. Governor Oliver Morton of Indiana called on Wallace once more, this time to help raise troops. And raise them he did. He inspired thousands to enlist, and he quickly took command as colonel of the 11th Indiana Volunteers, his own unit, known for their flashy uniforms and tight battlefield drills. Wallace was more than just a recruiter. He was a fighter. And under the blazing southern sun at places like Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, he proved his valor. His troops saw him as bold, decisive, and daring. By March of 1862, he'd become one of the youngest major generals in the Union Army. He was only 34 years old. But pride comes before pain. At the bloody Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, miscommunication and chaos in the battlefield led to a disastrous delay in Wallace's movements. Though he acted on orders and did what he believed was right, the Union command blamed him for the confusion. Newspapers began criticizing him. Fellow officers were whispering, and the sting of disgrace hit hard. Wallace went home, humiliated, angry, and tormented by the deaths of the men under his command. Imagine this, a brilliant, ambitious general standing alone on the porch of his Indiana home, holding newspapers that called him a failure. The cries of the battlefield were echoing in his memory. The smell of gunpowder haunted his dreams. And worst of all, he had this thought, did I cost them their lives? He would eventually return to command, and in 1864, he fought the Battle of Monocacy, outnumbered and outmatched. Wallace's men were driven back, but not before he delayed the Confederate advance just long enough for reinforcements to reach Washington, D.C. He saved the capital, but again, he bore the weight of defeat. And all the while, though he didn't realize it, something was shifting. The questions left by war, by loss, by guilt, were starting to stir deep questions in his heart. Who was he beyond the uniform? And what if death wasn't the end? It was an ordinary train ride, one of many that Lew Wallace had taken over the years. The countryside rolled by in a blur of winter trees and quiet towns. But Wallace was only half paying attention to the view. He was deep in thought, likely weighed down by the ghosts of war and the disappointments of his military career. It was sometime shortly after the Civil War, and he was now a respected but restless man, brilliant, accomplished, and unsettled. And that was when a very important conversation took place. Sitting across from him on the train was a man with a booming voice and fiery convictions, Colonel Robert Ingersoll. He was known across America as the Great Agnostic. Ingersoll was a skilled orator, a man who could mesmerize an audience with wit and scorn, and that day he did not disappoint. For 2 hours, Ingersoll poured out a torrent of elegant and ruthless skepticism. He mocked the belief in God, he questioned the divinity of Jesus Christ, and he painted religious faith as foolish and superstition. Wallace sat silently, listening. He wasn't angry, he wasn't offended. He was, however, ashamed. You see, up until that exact moment, Lew Wallace wasn't a man of strong faith or of doubt. He was, as he later described himself, indifferent. Religion was something other people fought over. Religion was something other people preached about. Religion was something other people clung to. He had grown up in a Christian culture. He'd admired the story of the wise men, and he even had written a small manuscript about them. But faith had never touched his soul. But now, on that train, Ingersoll's razor-sharp arguments pierced through all of that indifference. Not because Wallace agreed with him, but because Wallace had no answers. He wrote at that moment, "I was ashamed of my ignorance." And then, here is the unexpected of the affair. As I walked on in the cool darkness, I was aroused for the first time in my life to the importance of religion. He got off that train not as a convert to unbelief, but as a man very unsettled. Something had been ignited. He realized he couldn't just brush past these questions. If God existed, if Christ was who Christians claimed he was, then it mattered. It mattered more than politics, more than war, even more than his reputation. That night, as he walked under the stars, he remembered that old manuscript tucked away in his desk drawer, one he had begun long ago, a story about the wise men and the birth of Christ. It was unfinished. But now a thought came to him. Why not finish it? Why not write a story, not of the manger, but of the cross? And if he did that, he reasoned, that would force him to study all of it. Jesus, the Gospels, the history, the theology. He would have to learn. He would have to investigate, and he would have to find the truth. Perhaps then he would finally possess an opinion worth having, whether Christianity was true or false. And that resolution that day changed his life and the world forever. He went home, opened that forgotten manuscript, and began to write. And what flowed from his pen would become one of the most beloved Christian novels ever written. A sweeping tale of revenge, redemption, and ultimately Jesus Christ. But more importantly, that story brought its author face to face with the Savior he had only just begun to seek. Lew Wallace had made the decision that quiet night, finish the story, but he had no idea how far that story was going to take him. He returned to his home in Indiana. He pulled the half-written manuscript from its desk drawer and sat down to write. The story began as a fictional tale about wise men, a curiosity more than a conviction. But now it was a mission. He would take the story farther, from the cave in Bethlehem to the crucifixion at Golgotha. He would tell the story of Christ, woven through the life of a fictional man, a Jewish prince named Judah Ben-Hur. But to write it truthfully, Wallace knew he would have to understand the world of Christ, the man himself, and the meaning behind his words. So he began to study. He wasn't studying casually or for entertainment. This was the intensity of a man trying to solve a mystery that his soul depended on. He began poring over Roman history, Jewish customs, the geography of the Holy Land. He read the Gospels slowly, carefully, seeking not just some literary backdrop. He wanted truth. He approached the scriptures not as a preacher, not as a theologian. He approached the scriptures as a soldier turned skeptic, looking for answers. And something unexpected happened. As he wrote line after line, crafting scenes where Judah Ben-Hur's bitterness slowly gave way to redemption, Wallace himself found that he was being changed. The process was not immediate. It was slow, like when the morning sun breaks through. But it was real. He later described it like this: "It only remains to say that I did, as resolved, with results, first, the book of Ben-Hur, and second, a conviction amounting to absolute belief in God and the divinity of Jesus Christ." What had begun as an attempt to inform himself turned into a deeply personal transformation. Wallace did not find Christ through an altar call or through a sermon, but through storytelling, studying, and an honest confrontation with his own doubts. Remember, Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 13 says, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, was not a sermon disguised as fiction. It was a gripping, emotional, epic tale set in the time of Christ. This is a story of betrayal, injustice, and vengeance. Judah Ben-Hur, wrongfully accused and condemned, rises from slavery to triumph, but not by the sword. And by the end of the book, the man who sought revenge meets the man of sorrows and is forever changed. The book resonated deeply with readers. It was published in 1880, and it became an instant success. In a world that was still aching from wounds of the Civil War, Wallace's tale of redemption offered healing. In a society that often treated religion as either dry tradition or fairy fantasism, Ben-Hur brought Christ into the center of a story filled with real struggle, real pain, and real hope. Within 10 years, the book sold over 300,000 copies. That was unheard of at that time. It was translated into dozens of languages: Arabic, Chinese, French, Spanish. People around the world wept and rejoiced as they followed Judah's journey. And in doing so, many were drawn to Jesus Christ. And all the while, Lew Wallace, a former general, political man, became known most of all as the man who had written the tale of the Christ. Here's the thing. He never joined a church. He never took up a pulpit, but he believed fiercely and unshakably in the divinity of Jesus. The writing of Ben-Hur not only shaped his legacy, it brought him to faith. In Wallace's own words, his search had given him opinions of real value. And more than that, it had given him truth. Lew Wallace believed in Jesus Christ. Let's be clear about that. He didn't just admire the teachings of Jesus or write a novel that happened to include biblical themes. No. Wallace believed that Jesus was divine, that he was the Son of God, that the Gospels were true, that redemption was real. But despite all of this, he never joined a church. That might seem strange to us today. How could a man who wrote Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, a book that stirred thousands of faith, never become a church member himself? Wallace answered that question in his autobiography. With honesty, he wrote, "I'm not a member of any church or denomination, nor have I ever been. Not that churches are objectionable to me, but simply because my freedom is enjoyable, and I do not think myself good enough to be a communicant." In a time when church attendance was a central part of public life, especially for respected men, Wallace's position was unusual. But it wasn't born out of rebellion. It came from a deep humility. He didn't see himself worthy, and he feared that formal religion might limit the freedom he felt in his personal pursuit of truth. That is important to understand. Wallace's faith was sincere, even if it didn't fit into the usual frameworks. He lived in an era where public expression of faith often followed a strict pattern: membership, baptism, communion, service. Wallace, however, was a deeply private person, and yet through his writings and his life, his faith was on full display. He often spoke publicly about his belief in God. He defended Christianity in lectures, and through Ben-Hur, he offered a vision of Christ that was tender, powerful, and redemptive. A Christ who stepped into the lives of broken people and changed everything. To Wallace, the act of writing that story was worship. It was a form of devotion. His research became his discipleship. His storytelling became his testimony. He may not have sat in a pew each Sunday, but the fruit of his belief was unmistakable, and people noticed. Readers wrote to him, thanking him for deepening their understanding of the Gospels. Pastors quoted Ben-Hur from the pulpits. Missionaries carried copies across the world. The book touched hearts in homes and huts, palaces and prisons. Wallace had wanted to write a great historical novel, but he had unknowingly penned a spiritual tool that would endure far beyond his lifetime. In a time when faith often came wrapped in formal tradition, Lew Wallace modeled a different path, one of thoughtful, studied belief. He showed that genuine faith isn't measured by affliction, by the quiet transformation of the heart that's willing to pursue truth, even when it's inconvenient. Lew Wallace never stopped moving. After finishing Ben-Hur, he didn't retreat into quiet retirement. Instead, he continued to serve his country, this time not with sword or pen, but with diplomacy. In 1878, President Rutherford B. Hayes appointed Wallace as governor of the New Mexico Territory. It was a turbulent, often lawless region, and Wallace's military background provided useful. He dealt with political factors, violence, and he even tried to bring the infamous outlaw Billy the Kid to justice. It was a rugged post, far from the saloons of Washington, but Wallace handled it with strength and diplomacy. Then in 1881, he was appointed U.S. Minister to the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, and there he met with sultans, negotiated complicated political tensions, and even fostered remarkably warm relations with the Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Wallace was respected, not just as an American diplomat, but as a man of wisdom and fairness. Imagine it, the author of Ben-Hur, walking the ancient streets of Constantinople, engaging with Muslim leaders, representing a Christian majority nation while holding quietly and firmly to his personal beliefs in the divinity of Christ. There's something poetic in that image. A soldier turned writer, now serving as a bridge between cultures, carrying with him a faith born not in a church pew, but in the pages of a novel. When Wallace finally returned to Indiana, it was not because he wanted to withdraw from public life. He spent his years writing, lecturing, and reflecting on the strange and beautiful course of his journey. He penned his own autobiography, giving readers a glimpse into the mind of a man who had seen war, wrestled with doubt, and found peace in Christ. He passed away February 15th, 1905. The story didn't end there. Today, Lew Wallace's statue stands in the United States Capitol, representing the state of Indiana. There, among presidents and patriots, stands a soldier who became a believer, a man best remembered not for his victories in the battlefield, but for a story that led both himself and millions of others closer to Christ. Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, went on to become a best-selling American novel of the 19th century. It was adapted into stage plays, silent films, and then the legacy 1959 film that won 11 Academy Awards. Even into the 21st century, Ben-Hur has been remade, reread, and rediscovered. But for Lew Wallace, the real victory wasn't in the box office numbers or in his book sales. The real victory was in the transformation of his own heart and in that quiet certainty that in Christ he had found the truth. Lew Wallace's journey reminds us that God can speak through unlikely paths. A train ride with a skeptic, the sorrow of a military defeat, the pages of a story written in search of truth. He reminds us that belief doesn't always come in a flash. It could be built word by word, prayer by prayer, question by question. And sometimes the greatest tales ever told begin with a simple decision to seek. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of the Church History Podcast. Maybe this week you might want to, if you haven't seen it yet, look up the movie Ben-Hur. It's a great movie. It's long, but it's worth it. And if Lew Wallace's story inspired you, consider sharing this episode with a friend. And join us next week as we explore more stories of faith, courage, and the men and women who helped shape the church across the centuries. And until then, keep asking questions, keep seeking truth, and remember, God writes the best stories of all. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. We release new content every Monday. And don't forget to check out our website at lauraleesiemens.com for more information and additional resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week as we continue our journey through the incredible history of the church.